We are back. Andrew Lawton here with True North for part two of my interview with Lindsay Shepherd. We spent the first part of our discussion talking about not just what went on at Laurier University back in 2017, but the legal battles, plural, that have taken place in recent months stemming from that. Wanted to turn to another aspect of the cultural battle surrounding free speech here, and that is the woman that many people have heard of as a controversial figure, though if you read her words, that doesn't really describe her accurately, and that's Meghan Murphy, founder of Feminist Current, and of course now a prolific speaker on issues of women's rights and gender rights specifically. Lindsay Shepherd, good to talk to you. Thanks for sticking around for another segment here.
No problem.
So you had an event that you hosted with Meghan Murphy at Laurier, part of the Laurier, well, not at Laurier, but supposed to be at Laurier. And now we've had that you're back in BC, Meghan Murphy also doing an event in the Vancouver Public Library space where it really became a hotbed for controversy. People were trying to get the event shut down, as they so often do. You had a lot of transgender activists that were saying that this was a hateful event, that the library should revoke the space, and thank goodness it didn't. Talk to me about why Meghan Murphy has been such a figure of controversy, because it really reminded me a lot of where you were when this whole free speech battle for you started, in that you check off so many of these boxes that the left claims to care about, but when, you know, one or two issues of disagreement come up, you're the enemy.
Yeah, so Meghan Murphy is a radical feminist. So she's the founder and editor of Feminist Current. And in my discussions with her, it seems like she's kind of always diverged a little bit from the mainstream feminism movement. So she has kind of different ideas about sex work, for one. And so that's a new term I learned, is swerf, a sex worker exclusionary radical feminist. So she gets called a swerf, and also a TERF, which is a trans exclusionary radical feminist. So that's why she's kind of demonized by other people, is because she's a swerf and a TERF.
Yeah, and we've seen this really take place within feminists, where you get, I've heard of the TERF wars, the trans exclusionary radical feminists, so the feminists that think that a woman is a biological woman is a woman. And when you see that this side is really eating its own, I mean, if you're someone who completely is anti-feminist, I'm sure there's some schadenfreude that you can embrace about this, but for a lot of people, there's just completely no sense of appreciation for just the absurdities in this case. So you had the event in ultimately Kitchener. Did anything happen that made this a hate fest?
No, and actually, so you were right. So we originally wanted to have the event at Wilfrid Laurier University. They were going to charge us $8,055 plus tax in security fees to host it on the university campus. So that was out quite quickly. But luckily, actually, we found a municipal venue in the city of Kitchener that were actually quite helpful in helping us organize the event. And it went well. There was a protest of maybe 15 people outside, but that's it. We still had to pay for security, but not nearly as much as 8,000. So the way that Vancouver Public Library treated Meghan Murphy this time, just a couple days ago for this January event, it was really deplorable. I mean, they released this statement saying it's hard for them to host Meghan Murphy because they just disagree with her so much. And, you know, you kind of have to wonder, is it really your place to make a statement like that, you know? And then they changed the time of the event to make it 9:30 p.m. to 11:30 p.m., which, you know, kind of causes problems for people. You know, people who have kids, for example, can't find a babysitter that late, or people who have to work in the morning. All of a sudden, it's kind of a barrier for them.
Yeah, so this was going, and if it was going to be a brawl, now they've just made it like a late night brawl at the library after hours, right? I mean, by having it so late. And again, you had people that were, one in particular, a notable trans activist, Morgane Auger, who is herself a trans woman, so a biological male, lives as a woman. And Morgane, who said this was no different than a Holocaust denial event, according to one report, that, if a bunch of Holocaust deniers were to book a space at the library, it would be no different than a feminist talking about what she perceives to be women's issues, alongside several other people, in fact. And I'm wondering if you think, as someone who's put on these events before, that people are ever going to tire out about these things? Or do you think that as long as there's a Meghan Murphy event, there's going to be a Morgan Auger and a bunch of other minions trying to shut it down?
Do you mean like the protesters will get tired of protesting, or?
Well, the protesters themselves, the venues will just say, completely, we're tired of doing this. Really, will any of the people that are that have the power to block this, give up?
Well, actually, the Vancouver Public Library, after this event, they said this year they plan to review their policies for renting out meeting rooms. So that's a very disappointing thing to hear, because we know what that means. It means the activism against this event was in some way successful, in that they've at least pressured the library to maybe not rent out to these events anymore. And this is a huge problem, because something I faced a lot when I was organizing events on campus is people would say, you know what, we don't want this speaker on a campus. Take them somewhere else. Rent a space somewhere else. And it's like, okay, well, now you're trying to make excuses for the library. Now you're trying to say we can't have an event at the library because the library is a safe space. The Vancouver Public Library hosts some sort of LGBTQ reading circle. So that's why people were mad, is they were saying, oh, you host this reading circle, but you're not a safe space. And also Janice Fiamengo, who's a professor of English at U Ottawa, she was shut down by fire alarm at the Ottawa Public Library last year in March or April. So, so people can say, don't have this speaker on campus, have them somewhere else. Well, there's going to be nowhere to go.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned some of the issues that Janice Fiamengo has encountered. We're not talking about firebrand type people here. We're talking about academics. In the case of Janice, an English professor. In the case of Frances Widdowson, a very far left professor who's seen very similar things. Meghan Murphy, again, a feminist blogger. Most people never would have thought that someone like that could be such a lightning rod. And I remember when I was involved in the infamous Ann Coulter tour back in 2010, you almost expected it because, okay, well, it's Ann Coulter. Whereas now, to trip that radar of these radical anti-free speech activists does not take much. You don't need to be that significant. I don't know what that says about me that no one protested my talk at Laurier, but you don't need to be all that significant to really get this. We're talking about an event that had a few hundred people. I don't know how many of those were supporters, observers, versus people that were at odds with Meghan. But I guess I wonder where the end game is, because the best case scenario is that free speech wins out and eventually everyone goes home. But these people live for that fight in a way that a lot of the people that want to talk about these issues, whether it's transgender identity or any other issues, don't necessarily do. They're just there to talk about their research, talk about their work, not necessarily because they want a full-out brawl.
Yeah, and sometimes the protesters don't even seem to be specifically protesting anything in particular. So, for example, at this event, which was about gender identity and women's rights, the protesters outside were yelling, no borders, no nation, stop deportations, and, no KKK, no fascists. But it's like, if you go into the event, this was kind of a lefty event in a lot of ways. There was an Indigenous land acknowledgement before it started, and there was this Indigenous elder who spoke for 20 minutes about residential school trauma and Indigenous peoples. So this was not like a racist or KKK event like the protesters were yelling, right?
So for Meghan Murphy, you've had a number of interactions with her, you've booked her to speak. Does she still very much identify as being on the left, or has the resistance to her on the transgender issue really pushed her similarly in a way that it did to you, I would argue?
No, I think she still considers herself a leftist and all that. I think she's kind of always maybe just strayed a bit from the mainstream, and she's always kind of been okay with being a little bit different. And now I think she's just more open to talking to people she wouldn't have normally talked to, which is the same thing I experienced. But from what I can tell, yeah, I mean, her master's is in gender, sexuality, and women's studies, right? Which is something a lot of people would mock. But she really stands by her radical feminist ideas and all that.
I wanted to go back to that point you raised about, we're okay with the free speech right, but not on a campus. Because this is very, it's very much the same rationale as we're okay with her speaking on a street corner, but not in a public library. And eventually the goalposts are going to move to such a point where they aren't okay with anything. I mean, it's going to be, well, we're not okay with a library, but we're okay at some private venue. Oh, we're not okay there, but we're okay on the sidewalk. And eventually it's, you're okay, in your own basement with no one else there. And I'm wondering what advice you would give as someone who has hosted these events, you fought back, to push back. Because one time that you did this, you ended up raising, I forget the exact amount, but it was thousands and thousands of dollars for security fees. And as much as I love the idea of, just sticking your middle finger at the people that throw those fees on you, most groups can't raise that money. And secondly, I don't want to be giving that much money to these censors. So how can you push back that doesn't break the bank and that doesn't really cede this important ground?
I think it's really a cultural overhaul would be necessary. For now, it seems like you just have to pay the fees. And yeah, you are paying essentially to subsidize a protest against your event, where, the protesters are intimidating people. You don't know if they're going to pull a fire alarm. With the Meghan Murphy event, I mean, people came from, for example, there was one woman who came from Oregon. So imagine traveling that far and having it shut down, right? And when Meghan Murphy was in Kitchener for my event that I organized, someone came from Montreal, for example. So you're subsidizing protesters who have no regard for anyone else's time or efforts.
Well, I'm glad you've been doing it. I'm glad you've been pushing back, and obviously we all hope it's not necessary in the long run. But Lindsay Shepherd, thanks very much for coming on today.
Thanks.
All right, for True North, I'm Andrew Lawton.